Hello, I'm Richard Coles and I'm chairing tonight's Encounter in a series of autumn lectures here at St Martin's in the Field in central London. Tonight we're encountering the sacred, and to help me do that I'm joined by Neil MacGregor, who's been director of both the British Museum and the National Gallery. He'll be looking at art and also poetry, by the poet and novelist Ben Okri, Booker winner, and by the artist Nicola, whose own exhibition encounters a set of, well, portraits, if you like, of leading spiritual figures whom she spent 10 years encountering as she went about her work. We're about to start. We hope you enjoy this evening's encounter. Lovely to be here. I had an interesting encounter in the cafeteria here early on. I bumped into a couple, and Chris told me they've just moved to London from Northumberland, from Hexham, and he told me that tonight he'd been to Evensong, which he'd encountered here, the first time he'd been in many, many years, and how powerfully that had connected him to a sense of who he was and where he came from. And that struck a chord with me, because one of my most memorable encounters with the sacred was the same. I was a chorister when I was a kid. So I grew up in places like this and sang the sorts of things that you hear in churches and cathedrals and chapels. Many years away from faith, in my late 20s, when I began to have religious twinges, I found myself in Edinburgh for the Edinburgh Festival. And one afternoon I walked past St Mary's Cathedral, the Anglican cathedral in Palmerston Place, and heard the stirrings of Evensong happening inside. I hadn't been to Evensong since I was, I think, 15 years old, but nevertheless, in I went, and they sang Stanford in B flat. It's not up there, I'd say, in the classical top 10, but nevertheless, it was something that I'd sung when I was a boy, and I felt something within me stir, something shift, a reorientation to a landscape that was familiar but forgotten, an encounter with the sacred. Many years later, I said this to Richard Holloway, who was at that time Bishop of Edinburgh, Primus of the Church, the Anglican Church of Scotland, the Episcopal Church of Scotland. And when I told him about that, he burst out laughing, and I said, why? And he said, he's just surprised that anyone encountered the sacred at St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh, ever. It's a familiar trope if you are involved in the Church of England or its various forms around the world. Anglican spirituality, a friend of mine once said, sounds like a contradiction in terms. Well, I would argue that. But of course, the encounter with the sacred is not something that any church or faith tradition monopolizes. One of the lovely things about it is how surprisingly it can confront us where we least expect it and least aware. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that this evening, and helping me explore the theme, I'm joined by the poet and novelist Ben Okri. I asked him earlier if he'd like to be described as Nigerian, British or British Nigerian, and he said he'd like to be described as a human being. So if you've been down to the crypt, you will have seen the wonderful series of paintings by Nicola, also with us, Encounters, a series of portraits, I'll let her talk about it, but of faith leaders. To say it so like that is a very reductive way of describing it. It's a very rich experience. If you get a chance, go and have a look. And also Neil MacGregor, who's been director of the British Museum, the National Gallery, all sorts of other august institutions at home and abroad, and is currently in semi-retirement, justifying the cost of the licence fee, for which we're very grateful. He's going to speak first, and he's going to start with a poem which he's asked me to read. You have a copy of it in your handout. The Bright Field by R.S. Thomas. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside like Moses to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you. Neil MacGregor.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, for that introduction. And it seemed, as tonight is bonfire night, sensible to start with flames and fires as ways of encountering the divine, because it is in the flame that Moses hears God. That poem is, I think, a good place to start, not just because it's about an unexpected encounter by R.S. Thomas, suddenly seeing something that makes him think about the sacred, about the divine, because that's the way in that I think we've all decided to take tonight. Not encountering the sacred where you expect to encounter it, whether that's in St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh or anywhere else, but when the sacred catches you unexpectedly and you encounter something you didn't know. The key thing, I think, in the R.S. Thomas poem is, of course, the turning aside. And that is also the key thing in Moses encountering God in the burning bush. Remember, he's worried about what's happening to the people in Egypt, and he's walking, and he sees this bush which has a flame in it but is not consumed by it. And in that rather repetitive way that Exodus sometimes has, he says, I see the bush with the flame and the bush not being consumed. I will stop and go and see what is happening to the bush that has the flame in it and is not being consumed. And it is at that moment that we're then told, and when God saw that he had turned aside, that's when God spoke. And that, I think, is a very important point. It's not that God calls him from the burning bush. The sign is there, it's visible. It's when he stops to look at it that the encounter begins. It's an encounter of curiosity, of engagement. But the first step is his decision to look again and to wonder. And that's when the encounter can take place. There's a great deal of debate in the Jewish tradition about whether God is the flame, God is in the flame, or God is speaking from a bush in which there is flame. Jewish tradition, of course, very reluctant to give God any physical form. So the general view that God is behind the flame and not in it. And that is, I think, a very interesting idea. It's the idea taken up by another great Middle Eastern monotheism, the Zoroastrians, the followers of the prophet Zoroaster in Iran originally, now mostly in India. And you have on your leaflet, I hope, an image of the way the Zoroastrians see the flame as a way of encountering the sacred and what that means. The Zoroastrians, like the Jews, believed that there was only one God and that God could not be seen, could not be represented. And they came to the view that the nearest you could come to the divine, to the sacred, the nearest encounter possible was in flame. Flame which is insubstantial, visible. You can see it, you can feel the heat, you can't hold it, you can't touch it. The perfect metaphor for a close encounter with the divine. Developing, if you like, the idea in Moses and the burning bush, that if you think about purity, if you think about something that will make life possible, without which life is impossible, the flame is your ideal symbol. The symbol in which you can ponder what it means to be in touch with the divine. The remarkable thing about the Zoroastrian tradition, the Parsi tradition of the fire, is that it doesn't meet you outside. It's a domestic fire as well as something miraculous in a bush. And what you're looking at are a series of tiles, 6 tiles, made for use at home. They're only about that high altogether, so it's about that size. And you have it at home in India. This is for Gujarati-speaking Parsis. And it shows on the right the the prophet Zoroaster, who talked about God as the God of truth and the God of community. And on the left, the Shah of Iran, the Shah who supported him and who made the doctrine of Zoroaster the state religion of Iran. And in the middle, the sacred fire. The sacred fire with tongs on either side, so that you can, tongs and a spoon, so that you can feed it. You make a fire like this at home, and you make it as a reminder of the fact that the divine is not only ungraspable, but that the divine is possible. The encounter requires you to do something. It's an experience of the divine that can't happen with God alone. The fire will not survive without the human. The fire needs to be fed by us. It's a very extraordinary idea, I think, that the fire, the divine, will not survive on earth without us doing something, without our engagement. We need to feed it. We need to tend it. And then it will give life, it will give heat, it will allow light, food, warmth, everything that's required. But without us, it will perish. The nearest we can get to an understanding of the divine is something which requires our daily attention. And so the daily lighting of the sacred flame at home is a reminder that the ideals of the divine will function only if they're tended daily at home, not only in the fire temple, but every day. It is, I think, a metaphor that comes in many ways very close to the incarnation. God taking human form in a vulnerable form, a baby that can't survive unless humans look after him, that can't live unless humans are there, requiring an investment of the human before the divine can exist on earth, before it can be encountered. Encountered not at home, not in the temple only, not in the church, not only in the place of worship, encountered at home or unexpectedly, but requiring something from us. And the other image I want to look at, just to develop that idea of the divine which requires something from us, and the divine encountered unexpectedly, is on the other side of the same sheet. It is one of 7 pictures, all the same size, by a Dutch artist from Alkmaar near Amsterdam, painted in 1504, the Master of Alkmaar. We don't know his name, that's all we know. It's now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And what it shows is the 6 acts of mercy that are mentioned in the 25th chapter of St. Matthew. You remember when Jesus talks about who will be saved, it is, did you feed the hungry? Did you give the thirsty to drink? Did you clothe the naked? Did you welcome the stranger? Did you visit them in prison? Did you visit them when they were sick? And those questions are asked. And you remember that when the people to whom he's speaking ask the questions, he says that if you do it to the least of my brethren, you do it to me. This is how you encounter the divine, and this is what looking after the divine on earth means. And this image is, I think, the most powerful image that I know of the encounter of with the sacred. It's the first of the acts of mercy, the feeding of the hungry. And you can see on the left, maid is standing with the basket of rolls in what is a perfectly ordinary town, possibly Alkmaar itself. This is our world, and we are called to feed the hungry. And the man standing beside her is taking out the rolls and handing them, as you can see, to the hungry round about him. And at that moment, you can see that over his shoulder appears Jesus. Jesus is in the hungry, but Jesus is seen only when you start feeding the hungry. Just as the divine engages with Moses only when Moses has turned aside, stopped, and started engaging with it. Here, it's as you start feeding the hungry that you will encounter unexpectedly the divine. It is a very powerful notion, I think, that we can see the divine, we can encounter the sacred at the moment of sharing. It's the same idea as the image in the National Gallery that many of you will know, the Caravaggio supper at Emmaus. It's at the moment of sharing the bread that the pilgrims can see who Jesus is. It's in the sharing that the divine occurs. It's the same idea of the Zoroastrian fire, that it's when the whole community is together that the divine is present. And the Master of Alkmaar is, I think, making a series of extraordinarily important points, and particularly important for us here in St. Martin's. St. Martin, you all know the legend of him dividing his cloak and giving it, half of it, to the beggar, and then having a vision in which that half of the cloak is being worn by Jesus. It's exactly the same as this. The act of charity enables an encounter with the sacred, and the sacred is in the poor, the naked, the hungry, the stranger, those in prison, those in hospital, not where you would expect to find them in the late medieval church here. This picture is a very powerful statement, I think, of an encounter with the sacred outside the structures of an organized church. But an encounter with the sacred is entirely based on living according to those rules, and in the living, in the sharing, the sacred will appear. That seems to me something that is particularly important for us in this church, where the long commitment of this church to social activity, to social welfare, is central to the purpose of the place. But it's also, I think, surely this picture, a call for us to reconsider the ways in which we encounter the sacred and where the sacred is to be found in the world, the city, our city, just as this is Alkmaar's city, where it is to be found in the needs of the people with whom we're called to share, and in sharing with whom we will be able to encounter the sacred. Thank you.
Struck me while you were talking, Neil, of one interesting difference between those two images, the burning bush and the Parsi flame. The Parsi flame, as you say, is depicted with tongs and a spoon. It is a tended flame. But the interesting thing about the burning bush, of course, that it burns, but it is not consumed. It seems to not require human intervention or fuel in order to do its lambent work, but the other does. Do you think that's a distinction that requires some teasing out?
I think it does. It's clearly different points, I think, being made. The Zoroastrian notion of fire is that the fire, you make your fire by bringing bits of fire from every part of the community into the sacred fire. So you have the fire of the baker and the boiler maker, the priest, the soldier. The whole community is in the flame. And tending it at home, you're tending an ideal of the community. I think what the burning bush is saying is that fire is that encounter with the divine changes, animates, quickens, warms, energizes anybody, but doesn't consume them.
And also, I think, doesn't give itself to. I mean, there's that mysterious, untranslatable saying that the bush says, which is translated variously, "I am who am." Poor grammar, but there's a reason for that, isn't it? Is that because the meaning that is in front of us is one that, regardless of the degree of decision we bring to that encounter, will elude us because it's not there to be grasped.
I think that's the key point, is that it can't be grasped, and it's why fire is such a marvellous symbol of the divine, that it does all these things, but it's completely ungraspable and unholdable. I mean, you can't take possession of it. Just as Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, "Don't hold me." You can't, and that, I think, is that's part of the same narrative, isn't it?
Interesting textual variant there. Well, noli me tangere, don't touch me, in the Vulgate translation. We know, of course, the wonderful Titian painting of that in the National Gallery. You're formerly of that parish, of course. But actually,
this parish.
Of this parish, of course, yeah. But the Greek is memu haptu, do not cling to me, don't hold on to me. It's a very different thing. It's not don't touch me for fear of burning your fingers. It's don't hang on to me because I've got somewhere to go, things to do.
And of course, fire rising steadily. Fire is the way in which earth tries to reach heaven, traditionally.
Wasn't that painting reserved for use during the Blitz? Lots of other paintings, weren't they, from the National Gallery, were squirreled away in salt mines in Cheshire or something, but that one was kept.
It's a very interesting story. This is the picture in the National Gallery of Christ after the resurrection appearing to Mary Magdalene. She's come to look for the body, can't find him, thinks he's the gardener, and then suddenly recognises him. And then he says, "Don't hold on to me." And she's leaning out to him, and he's blessing her but standing back. And during the war, the pictures from the National Gallery were all taken away and put in the mine in Wales, slate mine in Wales, until the public complained that they couldn't possibly cope with the bombing without the solace of pictures. And so the trustees decided that they would allow one picture to come back every month. And the first picture that the public asked for was that picture.
Interesting.
So it was a public request. And it is surely, whether you take it as a Christian narrative or as a human narrative, it is about a love that is stronger than death, a love that can't be destroyed by evil. And even if there's no contact any longer possible, the love is there and the love crosses. And what a thing to choose.
Yeah.
At that moment, it was January, February 1942. So just after, really one of the worst moments, just after the fall of Singapore, and when everything looked desperate. And what a picture for the public, and not just the believing public, to want to be able to look at.
That notion of flash and fire and dazzle and sparkle, it's so much of a feature of the R.S. Thomas poem. I thought also, while I was reading it, of Pied Beauty, that wonderful Hopkins poem in which the glory of God is experienced in the flash of unexpected light. And I got a big chunk of that looking at your pictures, Nicola, which has these dense but glittering reflective surfaces, full of gold and silver and sparkle. And dazzle too, reminded me of iconography in lots of ways. But that's a deliberate choice on your part, of course.
Well, I used all kinds of different materials in the backgrounds of my work, but gold leaf and glitter and silver became really important in actually sort of depicting, I think, the experience I'd had, on the journey that I took with these religious leaders.
The thing that strikes me about religious leaders are very blingy.
They're incredibly blingy. It's an incredible, honestly, in the Vatican 5 years ago, Pope Benedict it's the only second time in history it's happened, he invited 200 religious leaders from every part of the world and every religion. And it was like being in a couture fashion show. The bling was incredible. The jewellery, the textiles, the weaves.
It's interesting, Ben, in Nigerian culture, as I understand it, which is very imperfect indeed, to speak of spiritual experience as somehow left field or unexpected would be very difficult for some Nigerian people to understand because it is so much a part of daily life. The spiritual is not something that's corralled off into unusual experience category.
Well, I wanna share a little something inspired by Neil's speech, but I had a print malfunction, so I'm going to have to do it from my mobile phone.
Text everyone.
Which is very digital. And it partly answers your question. And it's called, it's one of two pieces. This is called the indirect sacred. The sacred, for me, leaks through unexpected things. But then the world is written with the invisible ink of the sacred, and we only read the writing intermittently, if ever at all. We are the living flesh of the sacred ourselves, and only dimly do we perceive it through the endless distraction of our days. This is perhaps why the sacred stuns us unexpectedly. We might meet it on a morning in winter in the clarity of the air. I wandered once into the National Gallery and met the sacred in a painting of Vincent van Gogh's Chair. You all know this painting. I was 19 at the time. I stared at the painting for almost 30 minutes when suddenly something flared from within the painting and I caught a glimpse of an underlying wonder. So, for some, the sacred has been recorded in glimpses on a battlefield, amid carnage. Others have beheld it in the sudden flight of pigeons in some dim square, not Trafalgar Square, I hope. But for me, there's no particular relationship between beauty and the sacred, or between the wonderful and the sacred, because the sacred transcends our categories, our values, even our tastes. And I put it to you that the sacred can flame forth from ugliness. In the Gnostic Gospels, it is written, "Split open a piece of wood, and I am there." There is a Zen koan that hints that illumination can emerge from detritus. I suppose that's why they have the image of the lotus growing out of waste. A wildebeest may not be as pretty as a nightingale, thanks, Keats, but even there, the sacred can flame forth. It seems to me that indirection is the nature of our perception of the sacred. Our direct gaze rarely beholds the true grandeur lurking behind things. The most recent time I saw the world streaming with the mystery of the sacred was the day I learned my mother died. I went out into the street and everything shone with a strange light I had never seen before. In Nigeria and in most of Africa, the sacred and the everyday are interwoven. And some call it animism, but I think that's a rather unfortunate name to give it. I would call it a sense of the wonder of the world. And I grew up in a tradition where everything is touched with the gods. Heraclitus said this way back in the 5th century BC. There are gods in everything. And by that, he just simply meant that everything shines. It's just that we, only in extraordinary moments, don't see it. I would give 3 or 4 places where the divine lights up at us. Humility. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to be touched by, to perceive the divine if there isn't some kind of humility. And humility doesn't just descend on us, it is often inflicted on us by ourselves, by our circumstances, by our errors. Death. A lot of friends I've spoken to, death suddenly makes them aware of what they didn't notice all along. And finally, that very bad four-letter word, love. Too bad. Yeah, I think love wakes us up almost every day. And so for me, it's those three things: death, love, and humility.
That's good stuff. That's a healthy trio. But why do you think in the West, in the developed nations, if we can call them that there's a sort of deafness and a blindness and a consequent muteness that seems to have fallen us because of our failure to look, our failure to see, our failure to hear? Is it a lack of engagement, a lack of willingness to commit to that moment and the intensity of that moment? What's our problem?
You want one word?
Yeah.
Success.
Yeah.
You know,
success.
I mean, you go to places where hunger walks in the streets, and there's this kind of, you know, I don't want to in any way make poverty out to be this wonderful thing, but unfortunately, one finds more joy amongst the poor. Yeah. And I think there's something about success, the sheer weight of Western success. I think it's somewhat convinced us secretly that we're gods. I think it's one of the most dangerous things that's happened to us. It's a wonderful thing, because I love many of the amenities, but I think it's blinded our senses, I think it's blinded our humility. I think it's puffed us up a little bit. Yeah. And I think when the ego gets bigger, our sense of life gets smaller.
I think what Ben's talking about, that idea of humility is absolutely the point, isn't it? That Moses stops and turns aside because he doesn't understand what's going on. He knows he doesn't understand. And there's a humility in the face of an experience that he can't cope with. And then very interestingly, to follow up on that, the first words, what God then talks about is the oppression of the people. Yeah. I mean, Moses is there because he is poor, because he's worried about social injustice, or to use a modern phrase. And that's what is talked, that's what God talks about from the bush. And the idea of humility opening is a really important thing, and it must be partly one of the reasons why we think we understand through science or whatever, but also we think we're in control.
It makes me think of something. When you were talking, Neil, you talked about how we experience the sacred in sharing, when we share. And for some reason, what flashed into my mind was not share, but a very slight variant of that word, and it was shame. That we can be shamed into encountering the sacred too. And I remember when my first parish was Boston vicar anecdote coming, was Boston in Lincolnshire. And Boston, wonderful medieval church, wonderful 18th century buildings around that. And beyond that, a housing estate which was as rough and tough, and life was as hard there as any lives I've ever encountered anywhere. Scored high on all the indexes of social deprivation, but without any of the kind of escape routes that the inner city would offer. And I was called out one day to do a funeral visit in the meanest street in Boston, Jubilee Avenue. Nothing too very jubilant about it, I have to say. And I called at a house. There was a woman who died, and the house was a complete mess. The door had been kicked in and boarded up. Windows upstairs were boarded up. She had lived downstairs on a cot with her son, who had learning difficulties, and their lives were pretty tough. I went in, my feet stuck to the floor. Not a good look. And it was thick with the sort of tawny effects of nicotine, the whole thing. So I went in there and I kind of immediately braced myself. Talked to the son about this woman. He didn't have very much to say. And I'm afraid to say I made some perfunctory notes and thought, well, I'll go to the crematorium and I will do what I have to do. And thought no more about it. And made my excuses and left, shaking the stickiness from my feet. Next week, turned up with a sort of, again, I'm ashamed to say, a perfunctory funeral service, and found there was a congregation of 400 people at Boston Crematorium. And I assumed they were there for somebody else. It turned out they weren't. They were there for this woman's funeral. I don't even remember her name. And I couldn't really compute that. And at the end, I went to talk. There was one young guy there in his 20s, and he was mixed race, and he was wearing the uniform of an officer of the British Army. Interesting. So I went to talk to him, and I said, are you mourning so-and-so? And he said, yes. And I said, I don't know anything about her. Who was she? And it turned out that she had been the woman on that estate who had been the sort of default mother to all the lost and abandoned children of that estate. And there were plenty of those whose parents were missing or unable for various reasons. And she had taken them in, and she had done all the, just the basic job of love and care. She was as tough as old boots. She wasn't sentimental. And she'd just done an extraordinary thing. And I remember saying to this chap, why was she so important in your life? And he said, she gave me a sense that there could be a future in which life would be good, and I would be good and better. And I remember just all of a sudden feeling this intense feeling of shame, that there in front of me was someone whose life was radiant with goodness, and I hadn't seen it because I wasn't looking, or because I was too preoccupied with my feet sticking to the floor, not looking in the right place at the right time.
But that's really what the
Alchemist.
That's what the Master of Alchemist is saying, isn't it? Exactly that, what Ben's saying. Where do you find the divine? You find it among the poor, the hungry, the stranger.
And not always sticking to the floor. It's your feet sticking to the floor. And it's the texture and the grain of a life, vanishingly or remote from your own, different from your own. And yet you need to... And one sort of constant and I'm sort of an awful lot looking at your pictures, paintings, Nicola, is the necessity of paying attention, concentrating, really looking, really listening. Again, maybe a feature of our world and culture is endless distraction, one way or another.
The turning aside is so important.
The turning aside is so important, yeah.
Looking and seeing is sort of really undervalued and underestimated, particularly in the West, in a world that is full of words, really, where words are kind of exalted, I think, and actually looking and seeing, and most of what we communicate to each other is through our non-verbal communication, and that's the job of an artist, is sort of looking at that non-verbal communication and kind of noticing what's actually going on. The work that I've done is really all about sort of understanding the sacred in difference and how we understand each other's difference. And I think that the divine and the sacred for me really has sort of shone out in this incredible 10-year journey that I've had, watching people kind of confront in absolute terms their sort of understanding of people who think completely differently to them and who have faith completely different.
Often those encounters are notoriously sparky, but not the kind of flash or dazzle that lights a world we want to see. Often that's quite an inflammatory and an incendiary process, isn't it?
Well,
Has been.
It is. Well, look, a lot of people kill each other in the name of religion. So yes, you mean the meetings of religious leaders are
freighted with awfulness often.
Absolutely, and are often incredibly difficult. And out of that, it's very rare that all the world's problems are solved. But the encounter, my experience of witnessing those kind of encounters is that actually they can be really profoundly transformative. And what I have witnessed in the last 10 years are encounters that are a new thing in history. Religious leaders not only meeting with each other, but then working out how to articulate their difference in public.
You're talking to an Anglican here.
But we also I think the danger is also because we're trained, maybe even too trained, to look and see with our eyes. So you frequently hear people say things like, first impressions. He came in looking like $1 million. Everything is how things, but I think the real looking, the true looking, is the looking of the heart, I'm afraid. And it's for that reason, a painter like Velázquez moves me very deeply, that he actually invests more love in his looking at a dwarf in the king's court than at the king himself. He invests more love for sort of kind of rough, an egg being fried by an old lady. That old lady is more real to me than Pope Innocent. And the value of that looking is that actually he's not being taken by the grandeur, the worldly grandeur of what he sees. He's actually looking at maybe the divine that shines out of our wounds and the rents of our clothes. And
I wonder, Neil, just how often popes confronted with painters of the caliber of Velasquez or whoever it might be, or Bellini or whoever it is, sometimes think that must be a very ambiguous experience for them, because so often that piercing, concentrated view discerns a human, sometimes lost or at odds with or pained by the splendor and the gorgeousness of the office they are obliged to inhabit.
I would like to be able to agree with you, but I think it's quite difficult to find portraits of popes where the pope is visibly disturbed by the grandeur of his office.
Maybe it's my fate to perceive it so.
They seem on the whole to be rather at ease in that particular role. And I think what Ben's pointed is really interesting, is that someone like Velasquez can look at the outside of the power of a pope, but actually get much closer to, I think, the divine, to the sacred, in the way he paints the humble things of the kitchen. And it is, again, God in the unexpected places, God in the pots and pans, as St. Teresa is saying at the same time. And I would like to ask Nicola, your images of religious leaders, I mean, that is, of course, where one might expect to find the sacred. I mean, these are people whose job is to talk about the divine, the sacred, and the here, I think, aren't they some of them? And when you were doing these paintings, when you were looking at these people, did you feel there was something particularly sacred about them that had been shaped by their office, or did you actually find something else? Where did you find the sacred in those encounters?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and actually, it's the answer to that is partly why I painted out all of their faces, actually, because sometimes I did encounter some divine in the individuals, but actually what my experience in the sacred, the really transformative experience that I had witnessing these meetings was not in the individuals or what they were saying about themselves, or actually what it was in the encounter that they had with each other. And so it was a kind of, it wasn't really about them as individuals. I didn't, look, Pope Francis has an incredible energy. There's no doubt about it. Some individual religious leaders have more energy than others, but I responded to, and you might respond to differently. What really I was interested in was the transformative sort of sacred that I witnessed in them, trying to understand each other's different and really attempting with actual great difficulty to understand the sacred in each other when they have completely different belief. That was an incredible challenge, and the transformation and the sort of sacred that I witnessed was really in that.
It's very moving when you see that, isn't it? Especially when leaders meet, representing faiths that do have long histories of antagonism and hostility, and you see a great gracious affection and love and respect between those people. That is a wonderful thing to see, particularly bearing in mind that they bring all that back. I mean, one of the things I saw in the pictures was, one of the interesting things for me was that I recognized so many of them, even though their features were erased, because I realized I identified them by role, expressed through vestment, expressed through what they wear, expressed through the special hats, the special robes, those things which depersonalize people and kind of make them in some way iconic. A return to that idea of the icon, which is something that's very powerful, particularly when you see the pictures in situ as a sort of iconostasis.
Just following from Nicola's images, I just kind of wondered, I wanted to just put it out there. We're in the 21st century. Don't you think it's time that we started to consider seriously a kind of a universal spirituality? a universal religion, because in a way, all of the different religions, it's like we imprison ourselves within the extraordinary walls of our faiths and of our beliefs. And it's one of the reasons that leads to the difficulty between these different leaders of spiritual groups actually understanding the sacred in one another, when in fact the sacred in each one of them is often quite similar. It's quite extraordinary. The similarities, the deep similarities between the great religions actually strikes me more than their great difference. And I just wondered if it isn't time, if this, maybe the solution to this great carnage we inflict on one another on this globe in the name of religion and so on and so forth, if the solution isn't to try and move towards a more encompassing idea of spirituality, tear down the walls and the barriers and the prisons of our various religions. It's just a thought.
I think it's a very powerful one. But I would also say that, in my experiences, you have to do two impossible things simultaneously. One is exactly that, is to share that common experience of the sacred and what it is to be human in an understanding of a landscape, of a sacred landscape. But it has to be done with respect to the particularities of those people who come from particular places, that have traditions that are rooted in particular experience. Christianity, for example, is the only one I know anything about, begins with a particular person being born in a particular place at a particular time. And that continues to, there is no Christianity without that particularity.
I would have thought Christianity began with the phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Up to a point, Mr.
No, I get to, of course I understand the history of Christianity, but I'm talking about the living truth, the living value of it, the living, I would rather the love thy neighbor as thyself, if we could actually begin to work with that, if we could seriously begin to work with that, and work with the equivalents of that in every religion, because they all have it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting about what you've painted and also what you've talked about is there does seem to be a new deal, a new possibility now, to do perhaps with, in some places in the world, the sort of collapse of religious narratives. One of the, full of challenges, one of the opportunities is it does allow a renegotiation of terms, a rediscovery of each other in that particularity, but with those universal concerns.
I want to ask Nicola, because I'm picking up Ben's point. I thought it was very fascinating that you'd chosen to remove the faces quite deliberately. But one could argue that actually what you're left with are precisely the things that divide. The costumes, the authority, the structures of organized religions, and of course the fact that I think they're all men, aren't they? Yes, just an observation.
Yes, absolutely.
But the religion with a woman on his head, that's ridiculous.
There is one woman, but
okay.
very, very few. No,
Right.
No. The answer is no.
Right.
Across the world.
Well, that's ridiculous.
North, south, east, west. But
the-
in answer to that, yes.
To ask the question.
So-
you could argue that actually what you've not painted is really the sacred part of each of them. And I don't know whether that was the humanity, the
yes.
shared humanity. And I don't know whether that was a
Possibly,
deliberate point
but
or not.
I think that also, yes, if you want to sort of read it as the sort of sacred being in the individual in that way, but actually also what I wanted to do in the experience of seeing all of these works all together was to allow the viewer sort of not to be distracted actually by perhaps the prejudice that they might come to an individual in viewing these works. But also to Ben's point, the history of interfaith is really interesting because there was a sort of whole period in the 60s and 70s where the kind of idea of God being the same was incredibly current and sort of prevalent. And actually, I think one of the things that is really interesting in the last 10 years with what they've been doing is that actually kind of holding difference and not sort of trying to create a situation where everything where we are all the same, because
that's not what I'm saying. It's not about the sameness. It's about the same source of the divine. That's it.
Well, but that's exactly, in a way, that's, so theologically what my experience, and Richard, you can sort of talk about this as well, but what these religious leaders have been doing in the last 10 years is actually the way theologically that most of them have been able to talk about each other in public without undermining in any way the strength of their own belief is exactly that, and that God is actually bigger than than any human understanding, and in that sense it is the same source.
I think one of the interesting things coming up here is a sort of problem that we have, which is about organised religion, institutionalised religion, religion of robe and role and doctrine and dogma, all that kind of thing. If there was a way of doing religion without that, I'd be very interested to hear about it. My experience is that you can't.
It's called spirituality.
Well, spirituality is a sort of cash.
No, it's not actually. It's not. Spirituality is just a sense of the marvelousness of the world. It's you know, I don't see that spirituality needs to be organized. Everybody has this feeling. Everybody has this feeling. Even atheists have this feeling that the world is numinous in some way, that the world is beyond explanation. But everybody has a sense of wonder.
I absolutely agree with you.
I don't think that can be corralled.
I don't know. I think I disagree, Ben. I think it has to be sustained.
I don't think the sense of wonder can be corralled.
No, I agree. The sense of wonder can't be. But I think our
experience of it can't be corralled. Our sense of it can't be corralled. When a child looks at the sun, when my daughter looks at the sun and says, "Light," you can't corral that.
But when we look at the painting by the master of Alkmaar of the distribution of bread to the hungry, we're looking at something that comes from a tradition,
with a shape
and a structure that needs to be sustained. I absolutely get
But when
this.
you look at the chair by Van Gogh, you're not looking at a structure, you're looking at a heart that sees a chair and sees the whole history of sunlight and trees and the earth and soil and cultivation shining forth in that chair. That's wonder.
But also
that's
someone
divine.
who stands in a narrative tradition, who stands in a history, who stands in history, not just a history.
Yeah, but we all stand in history.
I know, but what I mean is you can't get rid of that. You can't abandon that stuff. You can't just sort of slough that off like an unhelpful, unwanted, tired skin. It is who we are. It makes us too. And one of the real challenges for a religious professional is how do you not strangle the reason you got into it in the first place by serving it in the way we do.
But I think you have to slough your skin.
Exactly.
I think you have to slough your skin because otherwise you're imprisoned in the same old skin.
Yeah.
That's why the whole image of sloughing one's skin is important. We have to renew our spirituality. We have to renew our sense of ourselves in relation to the world, in relation to the glory of the world. We have to always do that. If we keep it always the same, if we keep it within its rigidity, there's no way we can experience the grandeur that you're talking about.
But I think
we only experience it through the tradition itself, not through ourselves.
But then I think again of that moment of re-encounter that I had, because I was programmed to do it, because I sang Evensong as a chorister when I was a kid, and when I was kind of lost at the end of my 20s and heard that again, that was because Evensong was being done in the Anglican Cathedral of St Mary's, Palmerston Place, and somehow sustaining the means, the operation, the structure, the plant, the infrastructure, whatever it is, in order to allow that religious experience not to be lost, not to be unknown, not to be unnameable, not to be decided upon in the way that Neil was talking about. That's a really tough challenge. And as a religious professional, and this language is uncomfortable, I know, you're the host at the party, that in order for everyone else to have a nice time, you sacrifice your own. And there's some interesting dynamic of betrayal in that, which is a very tough one to live with. But it is, I think, inescapable and unavoidable. And that's why those pictures of faith leaders are so interesting, because so many of them, by being absent from the roles which you paint, I think speak about that, the sacrificial nature of having.
It's why I like St. Francis.
Yeah.
You know, he just took off his clothes and gave it away. He sloughed his worldliness.
But then don't you think of that bloke who used to work for Gandhi, who said, "You've no idea how much it costs us to keep him in poverty."
That's Gandhi. Francis is different from Gandhi.
Sure. But there is something about that, display which begs a lot of questions.
I don't think with Francis it was display. I think it was a genuine feeling for...
Oh, I'm sure it was. I don't mean to denigrate it at all. But I wonder if there was some rather careworn brethren around him, enabling him to make those extraordinary gestures.
Well, I don't know. Jesus made those gestures too. There wasn't a big organization around him at the time.
No.
I don't know. I think that when you look at the beginning of all great religions, there's something simpler about these great figures. Something simpler.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you talk about the big structures that are needed, and I understand what you're saying, and I don't see why that simplicity that really started the whole great adventure of the Spirit, why we need to lose that because of the big structures. That's all I'm saying. And if we're going to talk about encounter the divine, I think that's one of the places we really need to start.
Yeah. We're trying to square a circle here.
Well, you are, and it is very interesting. Ben's point about St. Francis is a particularly interesting one because Francis, of course, what he wants to do is actually to reform the structure, not just to find it outside. I mean, he then goes to the Pope and says, let's make this better. And but that need to have a space really where people can gather, I think, is the point. I think what you're both saying in different ways is that the sharing that experience is what is also part of the divine. That's the exchange of the leaders or sharing the response to the sacred. And that has always required some kind of organization, some kind of building, some kind of structure, which then needs to be renewed the minute it's there. But I think
I also want to, I also want to return to us, the people, who, as it were, help to make these structures. I'd like to return to us the sense that actually the divine is ours too. It always was ours. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, the church leaders are constantly.
The church moves. The church takes that away from us a little bit, and we sort of have to go there for the divine. And I just want to say, actually, it's our birthright.
Yeah. Now, I used to work in Uganda. It was very interesting there. There was very intense church politics between the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics and various other games in town. And then they had this extraordinary experience of the Balakale, this revival of kind of young people coming up, intense experience of the Spirit that both kind of shamed and reinvigorated and restructured, reconfigured those church structures. An interesting dynamic, and one that repeats throughout the history of not just Christianity but other faiths. I think that experience of all of a sudden the collapse of the consensus and something new.
Something has to be renewed.
Yeah, and a new game in town that sort of shocks. And you see it in art. I was thinking of one of my favourite Franciscan saints, St. Joseph Coppertino, patron saint of aviators, 17th century levitator, from a little town in Puglia, completely unimportant, was thought to be stupid, but miraculously passed an exam for the priesthood and became a Franciscan priest. He's also the patron saint of examinees. But he was he's very useful indeed. Aviators and examinees. You
should have told me this 30 years ago.
I have to say, I took a tertiary relic into my finals and it worked out well. But anyway, but he was an extraordinary person because he was a contemporary of Descartes, but he was levitating wildly with all the enthusiasm of a medieval saint, but actually one who belonged to the era of the Enlightenment, of course. But there's famous stories about him visiting, I think it was Martin V was the Pope at the time, and he levitated up to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, much to the irritation of his superior, who told him to stop showing off and come down. But what I mean is what was so interesting, and he had a tragic life, actually. And he ended up being practically imprisoned in the cloister because they didn't really know what to do with him. But it's a fascinating story of someone full of a kind of mystical energy that you think would belong to the Middle Ages and earlier, appearing surprisingly in the 17th century. Lots to discuss in there. I'm going on. I'm really conscious that we have lots of people here. I'm sure have lots of questions. With your permission, we can
yes.
There's some people have roving microphones. If you'd like to ask a question, we'll do our very best.
I mean, the reason I made this work in the first place is you know, my own experience of living in a multi-faith, multi-heritage family on a micro kind of daily basis. The kind of challenges and the divine in difference is actually really what excites me and I'm interested in. And I think that. Sorry, I've got. You.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly? Yeah. Yes. I think your request is simplistic. I don't think you're going to get to where you want to get to by asking the church alone to teach religious literacy. Yeah. Can I finish, please? It's.
Have you lost one?
I don't, well. What I was trying to say is that you can't get to that position by asking the church alone to teach religious literacy. It is a complete world faith thing. And if we're really, really honest, the very nature of religion, the very nature of structured religion, already by the very fact of it, makes it very difficult for what you're talking about. So the religions themselves have to somehow be transformed in order to, as it were, be able to respect all the others. It's a very, very complex thing. It cannot be done just by the church. You talked about the carnage between religions. Take, for example, the Middle East. It's a huge problem. It is a vast problem. It's not going to change just because we want it to. Because we're talking about people on the ground. I'm being given another. Thank you. We're talking about people on the ground. We're talking about human beings who have been taught very deeply, very profoundly, to see the world in a certain way. You know, it's too deep. I don't use the word indoctrination for us to wish away so easily. We need a greater, deeper, longer solution to it, and it has to be spiritual rather than religious.
Thank you, Ben. Neil, did you want to say anything on it? Have another question, please. It's a very interesting one. I mean, I started off as a chorister. I was classically trained, and then, for those who don't know, I had some adventures in the 1980s in pop music in a very different musical world. But actually, as the son of a friend of mine, looking at a video of me in 1986, said, "You may have been in a pop band, but there was obviously a vicar struggling to get out." And I think in that, what they perceived was that I've always found music to be extremely resonant in expressing a kind of hope for something better, a sense of, what I realise now, would be the idea that there's a world beyond this world which somehow sheds its peculiar light and its peculiar shade into our world and kind of awakens us to the possibility of a life transformed, gives us a sustainable hope for things. And that's something that I worked out on the dance floors of the gay nightclubs in London in the 1980s, as much as I did in the choir stalls in the 1970s, and also rediscovered in Uganda in some of the traditional African music that I discovered there many years later. Interestingly, one of the things that I spent 2 years living in a monastery, which is a salutary thing to do. 2 years singing every day plain chant. And very interesting, I find more and more that is musically the place where my experience of the transcendent and the numinous and the beautiful is often associated now with plain chant. And one of the interesting things about plain chant, very distinctive to the Western tradition, it's very, very close to other forms of music and it's because it belongs to a monastic. It sounds like a terrible sort of boastful itinerary, but I spent some time in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, and I ended up staying in a monastery, a Buddhist monastery there, the Ganda monastery, just before the end of the kind of Soviet domination of that period. And what was fascinating was finding a group of men who lived together, who faced each other day by day across a sacred space, who had books of chant in front of them and recited antiphonally their sacred scriptures to each other. It couldn't have been further from the Western Benedictine tradition that I'd spent some time in, and yet it was so obviously a parallel experience, to the point where you couldn't help wondering if there'd been somewhere, maybe Alexandria, maybe very early on, where those two traditions exchanged ideas. Or maybe just tells you something about how we pattern spiritual experience through music, through words, through structure, through liturgy, whatever it might be. That it's something that just produces distinctive forms.
Can I ask the same question of Neil? Can I ask you the same question in terms of painting, in terms of art?
Yes,
do you find?
I think what you're really talking about is the language in which we articulate the experience, the language which we're trained to respond to it. And that's a visual language as well as a religious liturgical one or a musical one. And I think most people I think, coming from a Western tradition, find it very difficult to engage with a Buddhist visual tradition of complex imagery beyond just the figure of the Buddha. Once you get into those very elaborate narratives of Buddhist art, most of us find it very difficult to read, to engage with, to use it. And I think that's why I would just like to take issue with you, Ben, about the damaging nature of a structure. We need to learn a language in which to do this. I mean, that's really what these traditions are, the different languages in which we can ask the same questions and broadly articulate our own experience and responses. And visually, I think very much, we most of us find the imagery of alien, to us alien religions, very, very hard to use. And it's just like a language.
But it's also a matter of training. I mean,
that's what I mean. You can learn a different language. Of course.
We start with alien artistic traditions of other people being alien to us. But the deeper that we engage, with the depth of our engagement, they become part of our own experience, become part of our own history. In the same way that the first encounter that the Western mind had with African art was one of horror. Hence, you've got the burning of the Benin masks and the Benin sculptures in the 19th century, because these works of art were seen as works of the devil. This was a kind of structured language perception of other things, which 100 years later got transformed into something else, as you can see in the history of modern art. So it's not that we need a language, but we don't have to stop with the language.
Precisely.
The language is always a tool for us to constantly expand the possibilities of the spirit. So language itself must submit itself to the spirit and not be the thing that defines it, is what I'm trying to say.
And you see that happening in also, I mean, to get to plain chant again, the impact that Islam had on Christianity in southern Spain and North Africa, much more interesting, much more, you know much more about this than I do, Neil, but there was a very rich conversation between those two traditions, and there's this Mozarabic tradition in plainsong where you get these you hear these very melismatic lines, ornate, and you hear them always in corner, it's like there's something about a very rich conversation happening between two traditions and producing this interesting hybrid that's entirely within its tradition, entirely faithful to its language, but expressing something new and enriching from outside.
More questions?
Yes. Hi. That's a very interesting problematic, isn't it? Because I'm sure all of us have that experience, and yet the minute you try to formalize it in any way, you realize that it's elusive and it goes. I remember one of the most powerful experiences of my own life was I went to Hoxton in Suffolk with a monk who told me that in Hoxton, traditionally the place of the martyrdom of St. Edmund, who was hiding under a bridge, being pursued by, I think, Ivar the Boneless, I'm not sure who it was, and he had glittering golden spurs, and a bride and her groom leaving church saw his glittering spurs under the bridge and gave him away to Ivar the Boneless, who made short work of him. It was a nasty story. The martyrdom of St. Edmund. And I ended up standing on it was a January day, cold, bright, and I was standing by the river, just by the bridge, and the river was going past, and it was flashing, full of light, like diamonds sparkling. And there was a sort of black poplar, and I think its branches or its twigs kind of leaned out, were caught in a breeze, and they began to shake in opposition to the water, glittering water going that way. And it created this kind of psychic hum. It's all I could describe it as. It was like Bridget Riley, a kind of Bridget Riley literally moving. But the effect of it was, all of a sudden, I was fully aware of the martyrdom of St. Edmund in a way that I hadn't been before. I'm not suggesting that the historicity of that account is beyond question. I'm saying there are moments when, I talked about it with the monk later, and he said there are moments when the membrane between this world and everything else is thin. And it was one of those moments. It's not something that I would, offer as an unarguable experience of the divine, but it was what you just talked about. Oh, absolutely. I think it's a very good point, isn't it? Is that we are creatures who have certain tunings and aptitudes, and we appropriate information about the world in particular ways. And so what might be overwhelmingly powerfully spiritual to someone would be invisible, unhearable, untastable to somebody else.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly Neil's that's exactly Neil's point at the beginning of this evening about encountering the sacred through the unexpected, through the indirect. There's no way the sacred can affect all of us in the same way. We're different. We're unique. Our senses, our education, our spirit, our hunger, our fears, our love, each one of us, absolutely unique. And different rays of the universe come to us in different ways. It's a given.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree. And the work that I've done is really, all my work actually, not just this work, is about sort of trying to understand that difference and finding the kind of transformation in for each of us in kind of understanding ourselves better through others and through other people's difference.
What about something that you didn't at first get, Neil?
Well, I think the point just made is exactly the same. It's about learning languages and finding ways of seeing what's going on behind a form. And it's like playing chant or psalms or whatever. It takes time, and it takes time to understand how they can lead you to something. It's a discipline.
Yeah.
And depending on where you come from, what class, whatever, is that discipline. But what we were talking about, I think, at the beginning, was the encounters that have nothing to do with that come unexpectedly, either from the natural world or even more, and in the Christian tradition, even more importantly, in the people you meet, and being able to see and keeping your eyes open to see the divine in everybody around you. I mean, that's the discipline of trying to encounter the sacred in the street, in the underground, is the point, isn't it?
Interesting word.
Yes, it's about a training. It's about the training to keep yourself open. I mean, Ben's is about humility. These are trainings of opening yourself to seeing things where you don't know whether they're going to be there, but looking, keeping looking.
But that's also why I think the discipline that clergy submit to, which is one of daily prayer, which is a very hard labour sometimes, but it is so important.
Well, it's not just the clergy.
No, but what I mean, we have a particular responsibility.
Yes,
it comes.
You can have that discipline in living in the streets of Lagos.
No, absolutely. But I'm saying
just training yourself to be open to the world every day your humble way.
It's just in our job description in a particular
I
way.
have to say it.
But the reason why it's there is it's through that discipline that you do begin to hear that surprising ping of sonar coming back where you didn't expect it.
But we have to say that discipline is not enough.
Yeah.
While we exalt discipline, it's not enough. I'll give you a very simple and slightly sad example. When my mother died, I was so distraught and unhappy and needing solace, and I went to my local church, and the priest there was a very, very lovely man, but had had no experience of grief. He didn't know what to do with me, bless him. Discipline is not enough.
No, you're right. The selection processes of the Church of England are not enough either, I can tell you that. There was a waving person there. Hi.
Exactly. Now, I would certainly agree with that completely, that what it's about is something greater than yourself, beyond understanding, grasping in the intellectual sense, as well as grasping in the physical sense. And that we know that is where we will find things that change us and energize us, not in what can be easily understood, grasped, and held.
That's that humility thing again, Ben, isn't it? I was very struck by Thomas Aquinas, who was probably the most fecund and intellectual figure in Christian history, and certainly in Christian theology, who at the end of his life experienced what some people think was a stroke, we don't know. But he said that the 2 million words that he had written were mere chaff. And he realized that his life work was as nothing compared to what he had just perceived, glimpsed in that moment of abandonment and crisis. Mere chaff. And the humility of that, I think, is extraordinary and powerful. And you see it, don't you, I think it hallmarks those who manage to inhabit those roles, sort of the people you've painted, without it sort of destroying them. They still somehow manage to sustain the necessary humility, to not be convinced by the dazzling reflection that their roles return to them.
Well, I mean, it's a struggle for them to do that, I think. Yeah. But yes, on a good day.
Okay. There is a perfect illustration of exactly that across the road, of course, in the National Gallery, as you'd expect. A painting of St. Augustine, who has just been trying to finish his great work on the Trinity and the nature of God, and is walking on the beach with a certain amount of writer's block, trying to get it finished. And he comes across a child who is trying to spoon the whole of the ocean into a little hole. And in his bishoply way, he stops and tells the child, this is rather a foolish thing to be trying to do, to get the ocean into a little hole in the sand. And the child, who at that, of course, immediately turns out to be Jesus, says, not half as foolish as what you're trying to do, as explain what the divine is in a set of books, which is, I think, exactly the point that we've been trying to make.
Well, there's another point there, which is that maybe what we do experience is that little spooning of the ocean into the hollow sand of us.
And the rest is silence. We come to the end of our allotted time.
No famba na ye